never thought I'd be able to get my son back.
Well, it's a devastating story.
I just felt in my bones that it was illegal.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. This is our last show of the year and a special one. We're taking a deeper look at the child welfare system. It's a system in crisis. Some say it's broken. In fact, there are more Indigenous children in care than at the height of the residential school system. And joining us now is Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott. Thank you for being here.
Happy to be here.
Now, before we get into the questions, we're going to begin with a story from Nation to Nation producer Kenneth Jackson. It's about an Indigenous mother who signed away her rights, or what's known as consent, and then years later learned she could take it back when she felt her son's life was in danger from living in a group home.
This walk in the woods between a mother and son almost didn't happen. When her boy started talking about ending his life, after years inside group homes, she decided it was time to take him back and didn't return after an unsupervised visit.
And I already made the decision that my child wasn't going to go back into harm's way. I was not going to allow for my son to have another serious occurrence because I did not want that last serious occurrence to be a suicide.
Her son was in Child Protective Services for almost a decade. We are not identifying her due to legal restrictions in child welfare cases. Still, her words are almost visible, even if she can't be.
I never thought that I'd be able to get my son back, and he's with me. And it's not easy, but he's no longer being harmed in the child welfare system.
Many kids removed from their homes in Ontario are done so through kinship or customary care agreements. Sometimes they're called private arrangements. That means a parent gives up consent of their child without a court forcing them. Can they take that consent back and bring their kids home?
There is a right to revoke private arrangements, customary care agreements, temporary care agreements, all agreements for that matter, that are done outside of court.
Marco Frangione says he's revoked these agreements many times, which often means going to court.
It seems to be a common practice with many children's aid societies across the north and across the province that these agreements are being entered into with huge power imbalances, no interpreters when needed, obviously. A lot of these families are signing agreements under duress, so they don't have necessarily capacity at the time of signing.
He also says parents often sign the agreements without a lawyer.
Far too many. And that is one of the hidden tragedies from those seeking veritable child welfare reform, not just in Ontario but across Canada. I receive calls time and time again from families who've signed agreements without legal advice.
He thinks that's what happened with Kanina Sioux Turtle, who died by suicide in Sioux Lookout in 2016 after spending several years in foster care.
I go to the graveyard every Saturdays, talk to that grave.
An APTN investigation revealed that she filmed her suicide inside a child welfare agency-operated home. She was suicidal, self-harming, but was left alone for 45 minutes the day she died. Only after her death did Frangione become the family's lawyer.
Had the family had legal advice from beginning to end, they would have been able to keep the society in check. They would have had appropriate checks and balances to ensure that their child was being properly cared for.
But the case involving the mother and her son didn't happen in Northern Ontario. It unfolded here, in Toronto. She remembers signing an agreement at this courthouse and avoided a possible court order.
I felt that I wasn't listened to, I felt invisible, and I just wanted my children back. So being in the basement of 311 Jarvis was really hard because I was alone, and I was pretty much alone through the whole process of the 2 years.
Years went by, and she had another son. They tried to take him too. Then earlier this year, she met this woman, another mom, who defeated a different child welfare agency in Northern Ontario just to keep her daughter. She did it by teaching herself the law and learning what consent means in the child welfare industry. Because a file was open, APTN is also not identifying her due to legal restrictions. But she had simple advice for a mother trying to get her son back.
And I said, withdraw your consents, because I just felt in my bones that it was illegal.
It appears to have worked. She's had custody of her son for over a month, with little interaction between the agency.
When she realized it, she fell to her knees in my kitchen And she bawled her eyes out, like from her soul, man. And because all she had to do was withdraw her consents, and she missed her children's entire childhood.
Now the two mothers go for walks together. They also attend meetings with other parents in the same situation and share a message.
Just take away your consents, exert your sovereignty in a matriarchal way, that you have a right to your children.
Kenneth Jackson, Nation to Nation, Toronto, Ontario.
So what's your reaction to what we just watched?
Well, it's a devastating story, and the worst part of it is that these kinds of stories are taking place all over the country. Families that have been separated in cases where the parents did not have their rights respected. And this is a big part of why we are working across the country with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis to see a complete overhaul of how child welfare works in this country. The trauma that's being enacted on families is immeasurable, and it will have long-lasting consequences. And these are exactly the kind of terrible stories that take place, and it's going to take a long time for those families to heal.
I suppose, what would you say to those two mothers that were sitting here instead of me and you were having this conversation with them?
Well, I think I would first of all commend them for their courage, because it took courage to do what they've done. And I would express my shared joy with them that they've been reunited with their families, because as a mother myself, I can't imagine what's happened to these mothers who've had their children taken away from them under circumstances where no one explained their rights to them, where they gave consent in a fashion that was not respectful. But I would encourage them to do exactly what they're doing, which is to get the story out and to work with others, other families, to make sure that the system is changed. Certainly that's what we are doing, working with leaders across the country to say the incentives are wrong in the system, the policies need to be changed. We need to get families reunified, and we need to prevent this severe over-apprehension of Indigenous children.
Well, you even heard from that one lawyer that they felt they were signing under duress. I mean, what can the federal government specifically do to make sure these kinds of things don't happen, though?
Well, it's a very good question, and the reality is that from the point of view of the laws of the land, as you may know, this is a policy space or a legal space where provincial laws have stepped in, and in some provinces there is written into legislation protection of the rights of the parents to be able to be forewarned before a child is apprehended and to make sure that due process is undertaken. We don't always see those laws being upheld, and so one of the things that we're talking about now is responding to one of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which calls upon the federal government to institute legislation that would set national standards for those kinds of activities and be able to find a way that affirms the jurisdiction that First Nations have to run their own child welfare systems, affirms the rights that parents have that are laid down in international documents like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and find ways that we can make sure that parents who are not supported don't end up in these circumstances where they don't understand their rights and there's no one there to support them in that.
Are you suggesting some sort of federal legislation and act might be needed? Of course, we had an Education Act that didn't go over so well with First Nations under the previous Conservative government. I mean, how would you sell something like this to First Nations who are tired of that top-down approach?
Well, we certainly have heard lots about how the failure of the previous government as they tried to put forward a law around education, and that has led to a lot of skittishness around the whole idea of federal legislation. As I say, one of the reasons that we take very seriously this the exploration of the possibility of co-creating legislation is because it was one of the calls to action of the TRC. In fact, it's no mistake that the first first 5 calls to action of the TRC are around child welfare, and one of them specifically calls on the federal government to enact legislation. But we are not in a world where we would do that of our own accord. If some kind of enabling legislation would go forward, it would have to be co-created with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. In fact, we had a conversation about this at the recent Special Chiefs Assembly, where they passed a resolution asking us to co-create legislation. So it's a very different context than what took place in years past. And I have made it very clear, as I did at the Special Chiefs Assembly, that we would not move forward. In fact, we would never move forward with federal legislation on this matter without the full support of communities, and make sure that we work together on what that should look like, what principles need to be laid down, and how those national standards would be developed.
Again, referring to the video, how surprised were you that some of these women couldn't or didn't have legal representation?
Well, I have been frankly shocked at some of the things that I've seen across the country in terms of what happens to young mothers when their children are apprehended, and these stories are just a few among a massive number of stories. There is a baby apprehended from its mother every single day in this country. Women go into hospital not knowing that there's a birth alert on their chart, and discover as they're giving birth or just after giving birth that in fact they were set out to fail in their desire to be a mother, and that it was already predetermined without their consent that child would be taken away. So these are the kinds of things that have to change, that there is an obligation to make sure that mother should know what her rights are, and that there should be a requirement that every other avenue is pursued to have an aunt or a grandmother take care of the child, to support the mother, to be able to allow her to be a good, strong parent, to support both parents, in fact. So there's a lot of work to be done. Sadly, it didn't surprise me because I've heard similar stories, and it's heartbreaking.
How do we stop it? I mean, this shouldn't be happening a child a day. How do we stop this?
Well, one of the things we're doing is talking about it. Every opportunity that we get, I'm telling these stories, and I'm really glad that you here at APTN are putting a focus on this so that people are starting to understand their rights and are starting to speak up about it. That's part of what we talked about in the possibility of federal legislation. In fact, that's one of 6 steps that we committed to as a federal government when we had an emergency meeting on Indigenous child welfare in January. We said we are fully implementing the orders of the Human Rights Tribunal. We're changing policy to make sure that agencies are funded for preventing the apprehension of children rather than incenting agencies to apprehend children. And there are a number of other steps, and these are actually starting already to make a difference.
Well, we'll talk more about this. We're going to go for a short break, but we'll be back with Minister Philpott. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Before the break, we saw the emotional story of an Indigenous mother in Toronto. She took her son back after years in the child welfare system when she feared for his life. We also heard from a lawyer who said too many parents are signing away consent of their children because they don't have proper legal representation. He says it's too common for parents not to be told they can revoke these agreements. It's certainly one part of a child crisis, a crisis in child welfare, but far from the only one. Minister Philpott, your government took criticism for not immediately putting more money in child welfare after taking office. Instead, you decided you needed to have a deeper look at the system as a whole. What did that review tell you that you already didn't know about the system?
Well, this is an issue that has gone without appropriate attention for an extremely long time, and I am pleased that finally our government has been able to take action on this. As you know, the first report of the Human Rights Tribunal on this issue came out just after we formed government, and Minister Bennett was able to immediately get resources in the order of $635 million to support First Nations child welfare agencies. But as we looked into it further, and as sometime after that I became minister and was confronted with the this extremely serious situation of the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care, it became clear that there was a need for more resources, but also very deep policy changes. And so this year in our budget, we were able to get $1.4 billion. We were able to write to every First Nations child welfare agency in the country and say, from now on, and in fact, going back to that January 2016 date, we will fund the prevention of apprehension of children. Will totally change what the policy looks like, because these agencies were being paid according to how many kids they apprehended, which of course is a terrible incentive. And we fundamentally changed that and said, going forward, the funding will be supported that will pay the actual cost of preventing the apprehension of children.
Of course, even before the TRC, there were calls to action. A lot of First Nations, Indigenous agencies were created after, I know, reports in the past. How can First Nations not be too cynical that it's just more rhetoric and, you know, the proof is in the pudding? When are we going to see kids, the rate go down and there's fewer kids taken?
Well, there's a lot of good news actually happening across the country, which I am happy to tell you about. There are many communities that have asserted their jurisdiction, and we have supported that. We see places like Shuswap, where, for example, the Splatson community has put in place a bylaw affirming the fact that they have jurisdiction over child welfare. We are working with the Assembly of Manitoba chiefs to make sure that it's very clear that they have jurisdiction over child welfare. But we're also seeing some really great work of organizations we've supported, like the First Nations Family Advocate Office in Manitoba, who are working to reunite families. I was out there a few weeks ago, and since we started funding them, 250 kids have been reunified with their families, and they expect to reunite another 300 kids over the next 6 months. It's absolutely amazing what happens when you go through the list of kids that have been taken away and the families that want to get those kids back. You actually can bring families back together. And so I think that we have really raised this issue in a way that has been effective and are supporting the people on the ground that are doing the work to make sure that families and kids are together.
Of course, if you look at the statistics, at least here in Northern Ontario, it appears the suicide crisis is directly connected to child welfare. How is your government going to address that?
Well, the suicide crisis needs to be addressed on a whole range of issues, but one of the things I would like to point out to you that I think maybe your viewers may be aware of, but perhaps not all Canadians are, is just how deeply connected the suicide crisis is to the child welfare system. You spoke earlier in your program, you showed a video that talked about the fact that this young girl very tragically died by suicide when she was in a group home, which is unfortunately a story that is not alone, that these kinds of things happen. The other thing that's just now being talked about more is what happens to the mothers that are left behind, and sometimes the fathers too. A report came out in the media just a few months ago documenting what happens to mothers after their children are taken away from them, and they are at very high risk of suicide at that time, because their whole purpose in life, their whole everything that matters to them is those children, and when those kids are taken away, what happens to those mothers needs to be talked about. So making sure that we keep families together is absolutely essential to addressing the crisis of suicides in this country.
Well, Minister Philpott, I want to thank you for taking some time to come on our show and talk to us.
Thanks for talking about this really important topic.
After another break, we'll have Nation to Nation reporter Kenneth Jackson, who will give us more details about those two mothers in Toronto. Welcome back. We're now joined by Nation to Nation producer Kenneth Jackson. He has more details on those two mothers we saw earlier and some of the other issues he encountered telling their story. Kenneth, I know we really tried to stick to the message of a mother's consent, but can you tell us more about those two mothers in particular?
Well, the first mother who just fought back to get her son, you know, she just got him into school. She had to fight to get him in school because the school board wanted consent from the agency that she was allowed to have him back. She fought back and got him into school too. But both of the mothers have something else in common.
In fact, I heard he's even taken a Ojibwe or Anishinaabe class.
That was his first class yesterday morning, Ojibwe, yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It was pretty amazing to hear that. But they also have something in common, though, is that when the agencies came for their kids and their individual stories, both of them had kids at the same time, or they had kids with other kids. So with Mother 2, she had a son that was a little bit younger, but the agency never wanted the son, just the daughter. It didn't make any sense, and it still doesn't to this day. And I've seen all the records. It almost seemed like there was something else at play. When the other mother, she went about 10 years and then had another son about 2 years ago. The agency tried to take that son, which she fought back, but she's had him ever since. So if she could be a mother to that son for the last 2 years, why couldn't she be a mother to the one that she just got back?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Minister Philpott, of course, said there's been a shift away. They're trying to talk about prevention rather than apprehension, and she spoke about the millions of dollars that's been earmarked in the last couple of federal budgets. But what have you learned about that funding?
Well, it's still being talked about. Like, it's still in discussion. Like, they've asked the agencies, Indigenous welfare agencies across the country on February 1st, they've asked them to give them a breakdown of costs, what they would need for prevention. We'll give you more money, but only for prevention, not apprehension. So they want a breakdown of what they're going to need to keep kids in the home, keep kids in their community, not 2,000 kilometers away in a group home or something like that.
What's the one thing the government can do immediately about this problem?
You know, there's one thing we didn't get in the story from Marco the lawyer, is that he had a great idea, and it was, why isn't there a 24-hour lawyer available to these parents? For an example, if you get arrested for impaired driving or whatever, there's a lawyer available to you. So an impaired driver has more rights than a mother does when they're trying to take their kids. Nothing's been proven about that mother. She's not guilty, but they can come and take those kids. They can make you, under duress, sign an agreement without a lawyer, because there's not access to one readily available. So why isn't there? So the government could, you know, in reality, create a system with a 24-hour lawyer available to mothers or fathers or guardians whose kids are about to be taken and have no legal representation.
How do privacy laws affect the way we tell these stories? As we saw in that story earlier, we had, of course, blur the two mothers.
Well, it's a frustration for me, because when I tell a story, I want you to see their eyes. I want you to see their emotion. I don't want you just to hear it. And the privacy laws in child welfare are really tough. And I believe the only thing that protects are the agencies and the government themselves. It's not protecting the family. It's not protecting the kids. Like, even in death, technically we're not supposed to name that kid, but we do, and we have, as you saw, Kanina, because the parents want that message out. But technically that's breaking the law. I think maybe that needs to be pushed a little further going forward. You know, particularly with the second mom, a file was open, the kid was never taken, and she beat them. I still can't show her face. She wants to show her face, but I can't. That needs to change.
Well, thank you for all this information, Kenneth. Thank you.
Thanks.
This is our final show of the season. We'll be back next fall, when it'll be the last full session in Parliament before the run-up to another election. However, if you have any suggestions on what we should do when we come back, drop us a line. Either contact me at tlamarand@aptn.ca or Nation to Nation producer Kenneth Jackson at kjackson@aptn.ca. And if you missed any part of tonight's show or any other episodes we did this year, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. Todd Lamarand, have a great evening and a safe summer.